Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. I think I'm 14 months TSW, and I have been steeped in the topical steroid withdrawal topic and zeitgeist, if you will. And I think one of the most unfortunate sentiments within the community is that doctors simply don't listen, that they are not willing to accept that this is real. But I hope you're happy to find that our next guest, Commander Ian Myles from the National Institute of Health, is that missing link. He is the principal investigator of epithelial therapeutics at the NIH, and he is the author of the preprint that is now out that says topical steroid withdrawal is a targetable excess of mitochondrial NAD+. This is quite an awesome opportunity, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I do.
My initial gut reaction was, this sounds insane. But then I quickly Googled it, and it was very clear that Google has millions of hits. And then, subsequently with other interactions, it was very obvious that this is not normal eczema. And so I felt like I could do a little bit of anthropology, digging through to see, because I'm stepping in after, at this point, decades of debate. We had the first data output where I was like, oh, that might be the answer. That's the sign that this is a little more obvious than anyone had bothered to try. And so the part that I would say was exceedingly close-minded, that I don't think I have room to forgive, is why wasn't there a research project done beforehand? You can either accept that you didn't know any better at the time and start to do better now, or you can play make-believe and ignore this and continue to perpetuate the same process forevermore. So those are your two options, are ignorance or guilt. So I'll let you pick, between the two, and we'll see what happens.
Commander Ian Myles, thank you so much for coming on the show. I appreciate your time. How are you doing?
Great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you're very, very welcome. So this podcast, I'm really, really interested to go through the study that you did, which is, if I'm not mistaken, it's the TSW is a targetable excess of mitochondrial NAD+. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Awesome. So there are a lot of people probably listening to this who are going through TSW, and I know a lot of them, pun intended, feel pretty burned about their experiences with their doctors. And one of the things I wanted to ask you is, as someone who's on the inside, is it as closed-minded as TSW people would want to believe, or is there more nuance in there?
I don't know that I'd say I'm on the inside, because to give you a little history, so I'm an allergist, not a dermatologist. And I had never heard of this disorder until I had already completed my allergy training. So in theory, would have been out, if I didn't choose to stay in research and academia, could have been out and about in, with private practice or whatever, and be faced with patients with TSW walking in. And I would have said, what are you talking about? Never heard of this kind of thing. I heard about it through an ITSAN presentation. And, when they start talking, my initial gut reaction was, this sounds insane. It doesn't sound like this should be true. But then I quickly Googled it, and it was very clear that Google has millions of hits on the subject. But the site PubMed, which I think most people know, but if not, it is the website you would go to search scientific peer-reviewed papers, right? So this is what a scientist would look for what we would say is biomedical evidence. When you search that, at the time, there was 12 papers, maybe 14, and there wasn't anything that had said, hey, look, we looked at this really closely and these people are wrong. It's actually not the steroids, it's something else, right? Or this is just a version of eczema, right? There wasn't evidence to refute it, but there's this mountain of evidence saying hey, this is real. And then, subsequently with other interactions, it was very obvious that this is not normal eczema, right? However one wants to define that. And so I felt like I could do a little bit of like anthropology, like digging through to see, because I'm stepping in after, at this point, decades of debate, right? Back and forth between academia and between the TSW community. And it was really hard to take the side of academia in the sense of it did come off very close-minded. I would like to give a shout out to Dr. Peter Leo, who seemed to be about the only one combing through the literature who you felt, okay, why didn't they listen to this guy? Because, he wasn't saying steroids are toxic to everyone. He wasn't saying no one should ever use them under any circumstances whatsoever. And I do understand that let's be honest, there were people on corners of the internet who would make those claims, but not in the mainstream. But he was very clear that clearly this isn't safe for everyone. And we need to maximize safety. We need to do specific research to figure out what is different between, these patients and everybody else. But it felt, and he's still a prominent name, right? So it's not like he's getting blown off because he's some nobody. And I struggled to just say, like, what are these people looking at? Because if I was going to try my best to be like, let's be as kind as we possibly can, and I will say probably overly kind, to your corner store dermatologist or that corner store allergist that I could have been, you want them to listen to the experts on things that they're not dealing with day in and day out, right? Like, you want them to say, well, look, I don't read up on TSW or eczema in general every single day. So what are the experts telling me, right? They get these kind of summary putouts from expert panels. And when those summary outputs tell you TSW is a figment of people's imagination, as horrible as it is, like, you want a system in which these people will defer to the experts in the world, right? To say, all right, these people research it all the time. They must know better than me. Let me listen to them, right? You want the medical lawyers to defer to the people who know best. This obviously, whereas it bites you in the butt, though, right? When there's groupthink among the experts and they all collectively get it wrong, and then they push that down on the patients. And so the part that I would say was exceedingly close-minded that I don't think I have room to forgive is, why wasn't there a research project done beforehand, right? Like, you could convince me, let's be blunt, like, you can convince me that the name is off-putting to a scientist in the sense that, is it really withdrawal in the sense of how you would refer to heroin withdrawal, right? Withdrawal is usually a very biochemically restricted definition. So is it really that? You could make the argument, as I'm sure everyone who has lived through TSW has known, like, you get exposed to lots of other drugs along that pathway. And I'm not blaming the other ones, but it becomes like, well, okay, he didn't just get steroids. He got steroids and Protopic, and he got this other drug, and he got this drug. So, like, is it really the steroids, right? So you could convince me that an academic could say the name TSW is inappropriate for what we know at this time, okay? What you cannot convince me is to say, therefore, I shouldn't look into it to see if I could learn more tomorrow, right? And you're day-to-day dermatologist. I cannot provide an excuse for people, for the stories that I've heard of people being overtly disrespectful and insulting to the patient communities. I will not defend that, but I will defend the idea that, like, okay, maybe they would share the skepticism that trickled down from the experts, but the people who had the resources, the people who had the labs and the research funding, and even to some extent a pharmaceutical company who would love to replace steroids with some newer, every steroid now is over the counter. So, generic at minimum, right? And so you would love to replace it with some prescription only, far more expensive drug. Where were they? Like, that was the part that I think, if I was going to share your frustration, having not lived through it, that was my frustration of just like, yeah, it seems close-minded, but the one potential good news is then if you can change the top, the head of the snake almost, if you can change them to say, like, look, here's actual evidence that it's a distinct disorder and deserves to be treated as such, I do feel that will trickle through down to, like I said, those private practice individuals who are just listening to people above.
Understood, sir. Thank you. Yeah, I hope you can imagine how impactful that sounds to someone like myself, someone of your stature, saying that, because I really feel like, the anger from someone suffering from this is justified, but at the end of the day, we can't demonize the people who could help us. And so I want to try to facilitate that conversation where we fuse together researchers, people like yourself, and the people who are suffering to talk to each other. And once you talk to each other, you can't demonize somebody. You have to listen to them. And earlier, you did say, "Hey, I'm not on the inside," so I just wanted to give you, if you don't mind, a opportunity to say exactly what you do at the NIH, just so you can clarify to people.
Yeah, I mean, so NIH, we're on campus. So the NIH is, most of the interactions people probably know about is it funds external research. So a NIH will write a check to a university and they'll run a study in their university, mostly in the US, but anywhere in the world. So I work on the campus, and I'm an allergist who, in my day job, like, I'm working on what the environmental causes of what I would refer to as common eczema, right? The normal routine one that everyone would recognize from across the room. That's atopic derm, right? And we work on the microbiome. And so, like, part of it is the environment, and then part of it is, like, can we use a topical probiotic as a treatment for atopic derm? So when I was initially presented with learning about TSW, it was not really what I do, because it became very clear that it's not a pollution exposure, it's the steroids. And so it didn't really fit. But just interfacing back and forth with Kelly Barta, who I know you had on the show and who's, very prominent in that community, it became depressingly obvious that no one with the resources to do this study was going to do it. And so I thought, all right, well, we already had one. Again, we had a whole protocol built out for what do you think is involved in regular eczema, or in the very vanishingly rare scenarios in which somebody has I would call it a genetic syndrome that includes eczema. I mean, these are patients who have eczema, but they also can't fight off certain infections, and like fungus will take over their lungs, those kinds of things. So it was built for that. And I was like, all right, we'll just plug in some patients with TSW and we'll see. And I told her the two possibilities were, everyone's going to have something that looks so similar to severe eczema that I'm not going to be able to help you, and I'm not going to be able to publish this. Or it'll be so overwhelmingly obvious, we're all going to collectively get furious that had anybody bothered to check earlier, they would have found it first. And, so it was a really rapid turnaround, in the sense that we enrolled our first patient on like May 24th, 2023. And by like July 14th, we had the first like data output where I was like, oh, that might be the answer. That's the sign that this is a little more obvious than anyone had bothered to try. And so, yeah, that's what it took. I would say I haven't yet had a blunt, we'll see how my ability to not demonize goes if I ever have to have a conversation with some of the people who I've seen in the literature be very critical. I haven't had that experience yet. I'm sure it's coming. But the part that I found so amazing, even like in the review process for this paper, is when the crux of what we're trying to say, and then you guys know this, like, TSW is clearly not severe eczema, like in a rational sense, right? But like, it could be confused with it if you knew no better, right? Like, if you didn't talk to the person, and like get all their other symptoms and all the other weird things that were going on, and some of the patients never had eczema before the steroid exposures and thus later TSW. If you didn't know any better, you could confuse it with that. But our argument is like, but you shouldn't. And here's how you could tell them apart. Here's biochemically how you could tell them apart. And the reviewers each time have just been like, well, how do you know this isn't just severe eczema? Some severe eczema patients have this. It's just, there's this disconnect with an openness to acknowledge that maybe you have misdiagnosed a lot of people throughout your clinical career, and that maybe you have contributed to this. If your name had been the signature on that prescription pad that had given somebody months worth of, high potency steroids, they ended up in this situation because of your prescription. And I will say the younger, like the fellows and the trainees, are far more open to it. And I did have one when I was presenting who kind of had that moment of like, man, I've given out lots of topical steroids. Are you telling me that I might have committed like 2 or 3 people to this? And I was like, yeah, you probably did. But you can either accept that you didn't know any better at the time, and start to do better now, or you can play make-believe and ignore this and continue to perpetuate the same process forevermore. So like those are your two options, are ignorance or guilt. So I'll let you pick, between the two, and we'll see what happens. But I think I feel like people are open to it. Again, it'd be intriguing to see how this is going to go over with the biggest names in the field who have been the most critical. Whose names, let's be honest about, when we talk about guilt, their names are on the treatment guidelines, right? Like the one that says, how do you treat eczema? And it's like, a little steroids don't work, use a little more. And if a little more doesn't work, use a lot. And like, those are the guidelines, and their names are on it. And I can imagine that there is going to be, you got to have some humility to wake up in the morning and say like, wow, that may not have been the right thing to do. And now we got to change course.
Yeah. I feel like it works the same way with a lot of different huge topics. I know in South Africa with the apartheid thing, they had the truth and reconciliation.
Yeah.
And you have those two choices. And just as a human being, it's okay to be wrong as long as you want to make the change. And another thing I'll say is it's very satisfying to hear. There's a saying, those who don't go looking for magic never find it. And one of the things I found is very quickly, like you just said, you found stuff. And for anyone listening, I just really want to clarify here. There's been years of debate of, like you just said, this is not, some steroids are not your issue. This is just, severe eczema. We just have to fix your skin. And the breakthrough part of that is that you have found one of the differences between atopic dermatitis and this topical steroid withdrawal. So I'd love to dive in. What was, when you saw these patients, and I'd love to hear what you felt when you first met these patients, but what was the first thing you checked? I mean, I know there's transcriptomics and metabolomics, but what was the first thing?
We'd started with metabolomics. We ran a lot of things at the same time. The metabolomics came back the fastest. The parts that I was struck by in talking to the patients was the flushing, which is different. Again, distinguishing from what like normal eczema was, particularly in patients. We had 2 or 3 in the group who never had eczema in any kind. They had some rash for, one guy was like working on his motorcycle and got a hand rash. And so that's almost always like some contact, right? Like an irritant on his skin. He got escalating doses of steroids, and then like 6 months later, he's on like the high potency guns, and then he like finds himself in this situation. So clearly the steroids are the only thing that changed in him, and you don't have 55-year-old men developing spontaneous eczema on one arm. So like you knew that wasn't eczema. And so you talk to him and you get the full body flushing. The term, I don't know, zingers, I think that was the one people are saying, like those electrical shocks running through your skin. This is not something, eczema was described on papyrus in 1500 BC. Like people have known of this disorder for a very long time. If people had electrical signals zapping through their skin, somebody would have written that down in the previous 3,000 years of human existence. So that was like, all right, that's not normal. The temperature dysregulation, where it's like a thermometer would say you're normal, but you feel like you're freezing to death, or you feel like you're on fire, right? Like hot flashes, like menopause might have. Like again, not a thing in normal eczema. So all of these are neurologic. And so we started by hunting for some kind of neurologic abnormality. And I do want to stress, like, this is important because when we set up the machine to say, all right, you process the patient's skin biopsies, you could set it up under the quote normal settings, which did show us just the normal lipid kind of oil defects of the skin. I don't know how much your listeners know, but like you've seen every product on the shelf now brags about having ceramides in it or phospholipids or whatever. And whatever with each of those. But in general, yes, those lipid classes are defective in patients who have active eczema, right? You don't have enough of those. And so we set it up under the normal settings, and it's like, look, they don't have these lipids, which could have been misconstrued as therefore they have eczema, right? But I thought, all right, we got to set it at the neurologic settings because I need to know if they have something wrong with their nervous system. And that didn't show up, but that's where this NAD plus, or also referred to as niacin, really like leapt off the page. That was that moment where I saw that and you're like, oh, that might be the answer there. Because niacin previously had really only been used as an oral medication for cholesterol. And the theory behind it was you take it and it raises your quote unquote good cholesterol. In hindsight, just eat more fish, right? But like the people stopped taking that pill because it's exceedingly good at inducing flushing to the point where you can't continue on the pill anymore. So you're like, now I find that like we got a drug absolutely proven to cause skin flushing. And that's the metabolite that's showing up in the skin of these patients who are having a lot of flushing. And then in other evaluations, you could see that to make niacin, that's how you end up generating a lot of these like neurotoxic substances. Basically for your body to desperately try to recycle the niacin, it is generating other waste products. So it's generating nerve toxic agents. And so, yeah, we started with the metabolomics, and that was really obvious. Transcriptomics, which is like what your body's actively making from an RNA perspective, showed the same. That's what those two things combined really pointed us to the mitochondria as the source of the problem. With only 16 people, genetics wasn't very useful, and I actually, like, as a unrelated to my official work, I have a whole book dedicated to why genetics is not as useful as people like to believe, but maybe one day somebody would identify that. But we did check a lot of like blood work, hoping to find some obvious blood marker to make it easy. That didn't turn out. There's some reason to believe maybe urine studies could do it, but those aren't offered in America at least. But that's where we started with the metabolism.
Got you. Yeah. So I spent so much time reading the paper, watching your videos, and so if I have this correctly, the metabolite tryptophan, it's so low, but it's being turned into niacin. Is that the sort of pathway?
Right. So to recycle NAD plus, your mitochondria, like as part of the normal process of making energy, right? In every single cell of your body, the mitochondria uses niacin or NAD and recycles it back and forth. In order to generate more of that, it has to break down tryptophan. So the body is just, what it turns out is that the mitochondria are basically like their accelerator pedal is taped to the ground, and the mitochondria is desperately just revving its engine as much as it can. And in order to recycle that niacin that it's using, it's breaking down tryptophan. So you just see this dramatic drop in tryptophan, huge rise in niacin. And then every, tryptophan goes to niacin, but through multiple different steps in between. Those things in between are all neurotoxic, which normally doesn't matter because your body has normal levels of it, it's recycled, and it doesn't exist long enough to create a problem for you because it's made, recycled, no big deal. But if it's made on just such a mass scale, then when you try to recycle it, you're not going to be able to keep up. And that's where we think you get the neurologic symptoms.
Yeah. And for this process to look at the mitochondria, I mean, I remember seeing you drew there was a model up there where you actually saw I think it's called the electron transport chain.
Great.
Is that, do you actually get to see that when you're looking through microscope, and how does that look? How does that?
No, you don't get, I don't think you could. You might with an electron microscope. We got to see, so when your body is making the parts that it puts together into the mitochondria, each one of those goes from the kind of gene to program the mitochondria to what we'd call RNA, and then that RNA gets made into the proteins. And so we pick that up by the RNA. We can just see that your body is actively, like, it's almost like blueprints. There's just like blueprints for parts of the mitochondria that normally you should only have a few of around, but these people had, 50 to 100 fold worth. And you're just like, all right, well, you could, and then when you see the function, the consequences downstream, you can presume, all right, they got a bunch of blueprints for making these parts of the mitochondria, and they have a bunch of the things that you would expect if they actually went through with making it, and that's how you connect those dots.
Wow.
So that's how you know that that part of the mitochondria is been thrown off. And when we have a collaborator who took, all he does is research what steroids do, or glucocorticoids is the fancy word. But he took people and just used 4 hours worth of exposure and could see that exact same part of the mitochondria start to change. So that does open the door to say, like, all right, well, if it turns up in everybody, why isn't it turning off in some patients? Because again, there are people who use topical steroids for years, stop using it, and don't get TSW, right? There are people who clearly do. Yeah, we could parse that out, but it still says like, so it could be safe, but clearly not. And that's what you would, ideally you'd like to have a screening tool where you could say like, all right, you got this blood level, and say like, hey, sorry, bud, you can't use topical steroids. They're not safe for you. But I think Dr. Leo has been very good and a strong advocate of just saying, well, if 4 months seems to be kind of that line in the sand, whereas like after 4 months of chronic use, now all of a sudden that risk is, then don't use it for more than 4 months on anybody. Like just use it for 2 months, 3 months. And if somebody needs it longer than that, they need to be switched to something else.
Yeah. Yeah. And then just going back to the actual mitochondria, I just want to make it as clear as possible to listeners, viewers, because you have this, and I'm still experiencing it to this day, this horrible flaking of skin, the skin just constantly falling off. And I was reading the paper, I was really getting emotional to actually see what the mechanism is behind that. So what's going on? We've got the mitochondrial complex 1 is in excess, and so it's just pumping out dead skin.
It's pumping out niacin, and then the niacin is inducing skin turnover. And so what we think is happening is there's a pathway called Wnt beta-catenin, which normally if you Google it comes up under like cancers, because like lung cancer uses that. But like there are no humans that don't have Wnt beta-catenin, because you can't make it out of the embryo stage without it functioning. And so, but it's the way that the body makes more cells, right? So if it goes haywire, that's cancer, right? Because that's just making a gazillion copies of itself. What we think is that the niacin and all those other kind of breakdown products in between are just really cranking up the signal to the skin that says, all right, we got to make more skin and turn over and shed off. And that's how you're getting this kind of just profuse skin shedding. Now, there may be other reasons for that. That's my, kind of an assessment of how that would come about. And I know we're going to get pushback because it was 16 people and we need to do larger studies. But the thing is like the reason why it was so disheartening, like I said, that second one where it's like, this is going to anger us because somebody else should have done this earlier, was that the second the niacin piece was in there, you could start to see, and the second, like tryptophan was low, niacin was high. And you could just really then start to slot every single symptom that the patients complain about into that framework, right? You say, all I need to know is that the mitochondria is abnormal, tryptophan is low, niacin is high, and I could have guessed all those other symptoms that people were expressing.
Got you. So for a second here, I just want to jump in with the subject of dupilumab. I remember going to dermatologists and explaining my symptoms, and they're like, Dupixent is your thing. You got to try it. I'm still getting sales calls from them, and I know it can be very useful. But so I'm going to try to piece this together very quick to have my question. So dupilumab blocks the inflammatory cytokines associated with atopic dermatitis. So for treatment in TSW, it would maybe lower that inflammation, but it wouldn't do anything, I suspect, about this mitochondrial abnormality.
Absolutely not. I mean, I think there's lots. You could take Tylenol or Advil to lower inflammation. It doesn't. Even this happens a lot in medicine, where you give somebody a treatment, they get better, and you start to presume that whatever the treatment was modifying must have something to do with why the disease exists, but like no one with eczema has a deficiency of steroids in their skin. And yet applying steroids can be helpful, right? It is just obliterating the inflammation, and it is preventing you from having active symptoms, which can be nice, right? You can enjoy that. But it is not in any way getting at the underlying disorder. And so I know the only 2 studies that are in existence of treating TSW other than ours, like I said, Dr. Leo did a pilot study with dupilumab, and he didn't have 100% activity. And dupilumab is not 100% in regular eczema, for which it's supposedly more targeted against. But, you know, again, some people got better, but clearly, no, it is not targeting the underlying problem. The same would go, by the way, for the JAK inhibitors, the PDE4 inhibitors. The reason we ended up stumbling on using berberine and metformin in the trial was precisely because those drugs are known to target complex 1 of the mitochondria. So I don't necessarily need to go after the inflammation per se if I can shut off the thing that is generating the inflammation in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really good to hear that, because I think, you know, and I think you may have mentioned this in previous interviews, is like, you know, this study is just opening the door, and, you know, berberine you found to be helpful, but I think I can surmise in the future we could see a treatment plan that combines, you know, all kinds of different stuff. And me personally, I want to throw it out there for anyone who has topical steroid withdrawal, especially if you don't trust your doctor anymore. You know, your skin can't defend itself when it's going through TSW, and you're so prone to infections. Like, you know, part of your speciality is Staph aureus, and that stuff thrive on that type of skin. And so if you don't trust a doctor anymore, you don't think they can help you, you could die from an infection. And it was one of the things I was told by people smarter than myself, is like, hey, you got to go to urgent care right now and get on antibiotics. Like, it's no joke. And I think having conversations with people like yourself will get people to at least say, okay, I can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. So yeah, I actually have a question before we get too much into berberine. Is that I remember, because I was treated by Dr. Olivia Friedman, who's a TCM doctor, and one of the things she said is, you know, because I was miserable, as you can imagine, and she's like, you know, a lot of people assume that, you know, this mental hell that you're going through is simply just because of your physical condition, but it's our belief in TCM that it's actually part of the condition. And it was so again vindicating to see that the study went into the parasympathetic nervous system, which would make total sense why I was standing around all day. I couldn't relax. I didn't want to lie down. I was stuck there. And I was wondering if you could explain that a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, it was the first time I kind of recognized that is, I don't know if you even, this will be a fun quiz. Do you even know why we get fevers? Like the mechanism for that? Like,
I'm sure I could probably try to guess, but it would not be a good explanation.
It's a wild answer. So you get in, say you got a skin infection, like you said, your staph skin infection. You release all these inflammatory markers telling the immune system, come kill this, right? This is an infection. We got to get rid of it. Those markers go into your brain, hit parts of your brain, and your brain says, I got to crack up the temperature. Like, it is an external event getting into your brain. You're not actively thinking, okay, let me go raise my temperature so I can kill this bacteria, right? Like, that's the process that it happens. And examples like that abound in immunology, where an inflammatory disorder in and of itself is creating a mental problem, mental angst, mental reaction, almost as if you might expect, right? Like if you had an active infection to deal with, you would want your brain to be on high alert to kind of say like, look, something's not right here. And so the parasympathetic, everyone knows the fight or flight, that's your sympathetic nervous system. Your parasympathetic is your rest and relax. And all those metabolites that I mentioned before, where it goes from tryptophan down to niacin, and as well as being neurotoxic, they shut off your parasympathetic nervous system. So your neurologic capacity to relax is taken away. And that, I think, I agree with you that even, and this is true for, by the way, for for eczema and for a lot of chronic disorders, right? The assumption is having a chronic disorder, particularly one like eczema, where you are going to itch and have sleep disturbance, that in and of itself is creating some psychological burden. And certainly some of that is true. But there's now, I think, ample evidence that inflammatory disorders will create a biochemical problem in your brain that you cannot, any more than somebody sneaks up and injects you with some, neuroactive substance. Like, you're not in control of that anymore. That isn't about you need to just toughen up or you need to get better counseling or whatever. That is a potential that this is, in TSW, the short version is like the skin is poisoning itself. It is giving itself a drug poisoning of niacin, and your brain is not going to just sit there and be able to handle that unaffected. And so those things cross.
Thank you for answering that question. I'm kind of tearing up right now. I'm getting pretty emotional because I just, traveled back to convulsing in front of my family for several months. And if I had heard what you said just now back then, it would have made me feel a lot better.
And I would hope it would make the doctors understand more and the family members, right? To be able to say, like, this isn't their coping this isn't about their coping skills, right? Like, if you snuck up and injected somebody with heroin, it's not, the fact they get all loopy is not because they weren't properly bred by their parents, right? Like, it's a biochemical reaction that you don't have full control over. And it is not made better by a system that is consistently insulting and dismissive.
Agreed. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Could we talk a little bit more about the studies that you initiated with berberine and how that went?
Yeah, we told people about it, and they were just left to their own devices if they wanted to do it or not, right? We're not enrolling them in a trial for it. We just kind of follow along. 3 of the people picked metformin. So we should have a conversation, I think, about the pros and cons of over-the-counter versus prescription. I'm not, there's obviously the like, well, has it been studied, blah, 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 right? But a lot of the differences is really like, how assured are you that the correct amount of the substance you're buying is in the bottle? And with prescription drugs, you get a little bit more assurance that, like, when you buy metformin 500 milligrams, that tablet is going to have 500 milligrams of metformin. So they went with that one for that assurance. I got to be honest, I'd say that the response to that was underwhelming. People got a little bit better. One person got a little bit better, then switched to berberine and they got a lot better. In the Petri dish, we could see that berberine was far better at shutting off the mitochondria than metformin was, because they both do it, but it's not like they were picked to do it, right? They weren't designed to shut off the mitochondria. They just happened to do that. Metformin does lots of things, and I'm sure berberine does too. So berberine was simply better. And so there ended up being, 9 or 10, 11 people who went on berberine, and 10 saw at least like a 65% improvement. That took 4 months. That was oral. Just so everyone knows, it was 500 milligrams once a day for a week, just to make sure that nothing crazy happened. There you go. Well, that that was that one. And then I don't think I have it around, but Solar Ray was another one.
Yeah.
There's some independent group called Consumer Labs that test the actual, make sure it's not filled with sawdust or neurotoxins, right? And so those were the two that passed. So we told people about that. It took about 3 or 4 months, and people definitely started to feel better. They took 1 pill a day for a week just to make sure their body can handle it, and then went to 2. A few people went to more than that, but didn't notice, like, going to 3 pills a day didn't make any difference versus 2. We'd be intrigued. We'll have to see how much regulatory burden there would be. We would be intrigued by a trial of doing it topically, since obviously the problem is the skin and not necessarily the gut or the rest of you. That could even calculate out as just opening the capsule into a bathtub and then soaking into that,
right,
to see how that works. That's completely unstudied and theoretical, but would be, if I'm being honest with you, like if my mom went through TSW, that's where I would tell her to start, just do a bath bomb of this stuff and see if you can benefit that way. So like I said, I'd say metformin is on the table. I was unimpressed. I'm impressed with its Petri dish skills. I was unimpressed with its human abilities. So, that is, it was directly selected for its ability to shut off mitochondria, and that seems to be what it was helping to do.
Cool. Yeah, and I've been taking it. I haven't been quite as consistent with it, but I have to be careful because it does lower was it blood sugar or blood pressure?
Blood sugar. Yeah.
Thank you. Blood sugar. Yeah. So I have to be careful. It's like have it before I eat, and then sometimes I'll take it and I'm like, my wife is like, "Why are you so tired?" I'm like, "Oh, right." But
yeah.
So yeah, I mean,
I think that topical might make more sense that way. Because to get more into the mechanism, the reason why I think topical might matter. So the way your body makes new skin is at the bottom of a hair follicle, there are stem cells, and they crawl up your hair follicle on the inside where you can't see it, and then spread out over your skin to like replace the skin that is sloughed off. And what we think is happening is like those are the cells that all skin cells are made from going forward. And so we think that the steroids are corrupting that, right? It's like breaking your photocopy. And so every subsequent photocopy is now abnormal. And so those cells live at the bottom of the hair follicles. So that's why I think soaking in it and getting down to kind of shut off the mitochondria in those cells would be what would be most beneficial, and explains a few other phenomenon, which is why would this take years to go away? If it was, you've probably heard of like rheumatoid heart disease, where somebody gets an infection and then it cross-reacts with the valves of their heart. This is why you would do a strep test, not because strep is particularly dangerous, but because it could cross-react with the heart and put you in a bad situation. If it does that, your body's going to try to destroy your heart until you get treated for a while, right? Like your body, if it gets confused and decides it wants to attack itself, it doesn't just change its mind spontaneously. So that should last forever if it was that, right? If somehow TSW was inducing some kind of attack on itself, that should last forever. If TSW was more like contact dermatitis or poison ivy, that should last a few months, right?
Right.
Why would it last for so many people like 3 or 4 years and slowly go down and not quite? Our hypothesis is that you corrupt those starting cells in the hair follicle and they just stick with you, and like no one really has a great sense of how long it takes for those to go back to normal, if ever, right? And so those are the cells that then we would like to see replenished and repaired. And so when you take the berberine orally, we're just kind of hoping enough of it gets into the skin to get to those cells, which is why I think soaking might be better, but we have to run a study for that.
Yeah. And that, I mean, I remember you saying that would also explain why, you have the affected areas of your skin all over your body, but except for where there isn't hair follicles.
Yeah,
and
that was very stark when you saw the pictures that Itzan shares. It's just like the whole face is on fire and not the nose, and then like sometimes it's on the palms but less so, or like you see the whole feet are swollen and red, and then you just see that stark line going across to the soles of the feet. And it's just hard not to put those together and say, because when we did the mouse studies, I gave the mouse eczema in a way that I would normally do it, using niacin instead of what I would typically use. And when I typically use what I used to give the mice eczema, the whole ear is inflamed and it looks like, oh yeah, you're not used to looking at mouse ears, I'm sure, but you'd be like, yeah, that mouse has bad skin. But when I did the niacin, nothing was on the edge of the ear where there is no hair, but they had like this incredible amount of redness down underneath where the hair was. And those were the two things that like, all right, well, you got the nasal sparing, only the hairy parts of the mouse are being affected. I wonder if it has something to do with the hair follicles, and that's what causes us to go chasing after those stem cells.
Yeah. I only look at mice ears, maybe every Thursday if I'm feeling,
exactly.
Not festive.
Standard practice, but yeah.
I have a potentially dumb question, but I need to ask it anyways. You talk about stem cells, and it takes so long for some people, depending on how long and how much they've used. I know it's not legal in the U.S., but you have a lot of people willing to go to extreme lengths to take the. Do you think something like stem cell therapy could be applied, or is that it just not work that way?
I don't know. The few times I've seen those like mesenchymal stem cell papers that come up quite a bit in Panama, and then it'd be hard if you're a sports fan at all. It's hard not to hear some athlete flying down to get him injected into his knee or something like that. It's hard to be dismissive without, again, it feels like the same boat that we started this conversation with. Like you hear it and you're like, because it gets framed as curing everything, right? Stem cell injections are like for anything from MS to diarrhea, and then you see it and you're like, well, you don't have evidence saying that you tried it and it failed. What we have is really just like no evidence at all, or anecdotal reports in positive. So it's hard to endorse one way or the other, but I mean, I think, it does kind of feel like the risks are known, in the sense that it feels like if you'd waste your time on a plane ticket to Panama or Thailand, and you'd waste your money on the treatment if it doesn't work, such is life. The same thing comes up with the cold activated plasma. Is mentioned quite a bit, not really realistically available in the United States. I know there's supposed to be a clinic opening in England, and then again another one of those in Thailand or somewhere near it.
Yes, sir.
It again, light therapy. I don't, reading up on it, it doesn't strike me as something that I would be particularly nervous about. If you waste your money, so be it. But you're not in a conversation about, let me fly to Thailand to let some guy inject me with stem cells because things are going well, right? Like you are in that conversation because you're desperate. And I guess I don't know that I would poo-poo that until real data is done.
Yeah, well, I really I appreciate your candor, but I also understand that you're a data-driven fella, and I wouldn't expect you to endorse anything that you don't have evidence for yet. I mean, I've interviewed several people who have been to the CAP clinic, and I'm pretty impressed with, I don't know, I don't have experience with their machine, but their protocols at home, they say that 50% of their treatment is you at home. So they practice this whole thing of removing as many irritants from your environment as possible, especially when your skin is so fragile. So they don't use chemicals. They clean the floors. For me, I sweep and vacuum every day, sometimes multiple times a day. And I change my sheets. And I really found that helped at least provide my body with a safe environment to keep healing while it was doing the work it needed to do. And so I myself, I haven't been there, but I'd really love to see a study in the US where they actually look at, okay, maybe 50% of you go over and you do just half of the treatment at home with no machine, and the other half you go and you do the machine plus the protocols or whatever, and see how that works. There's just so much to be learned, and but I hope in the future there's a larger spectrum of options for people, because I can tell you're just as tired as I am of giving patients one option that may or may not work for them. Yeah.
And I mean, even to say like, wouldn't endorse it, but it's not, I wouldn't ever talk anybody out of it, right? If someone is like, I got my plane ticket in hand, I'm on the way to do it, go for it. Like, it's no different than even berberine, which we studied. I would caution somebody not to just go grab any bottle off the shelf, because you have data showing that not every bottle genuinely has what it claims to have in it. Some of them are contaminated, whatever. So it's just kind of more general cautions to just say like, man, if you're going to try this, go for it. Here's how you could do it as safe as possible. Like you said, go into an established clinic that knows that, not some weirdo in the back of his van with a cap machine. Like, you say like, all right, look, I'm on my plane ticket. I'm going to go try this at an established stem cell injection clinic. Good on you. Right? Like, I'm not here to talk you out of that. So yeah, we need something, and I really hope that changing the conversation, I don't know. Like I told Kelly, right? I said, like, it's either going to be exactly like eczema and we won't know, or it's going to be so obvious you're going to get upset. When this genuinely penetrates the academia, either it's going to be, oh yeah, of course, that was ridiculous, and people will start researching it, studying it on their own, or they'll be like, well, I have some TSW patients, maybe I'll run a little study and see what happens with such and such. Or we'll get just like some tobacco science level pushback. I don't know. We'll both be surprised as to which one that is, because I really don't know. There have been some big name people who, for whatever reason, have been more firm to say like TSW is a thing and deserves its own research. I don't know how much sincerity I feel from that, because they have the resources necessary to do that study. So it's one, it's like a millionaire saying like, we should donate more to the homeless. And you're like, what about you, buddy? Right.
Yeah.
So it comes off kind of like that, but it's still at least a few more prominent names willing to put their neck out there to say, this is a thing. Because I definitely do think that Dr. Leo was among the big names, right? You had Olivia Freeman, like you'd mentioned earlier, like you had lots of providers who respected TSW and were doing their best. But among the people who had the big names, Leo was on an island for a long time. And I feel like a few people have finally started to join him. So I hope that then opens the door to somebody saying, why don't we do a CAP study? If people really believe this is true, and if it does work, why? How does that functional? Could this be useful for other disorders of the skin or other, stuff like that?
Yeah, I'm certainly hopeful that, I have certain reason to believe that eventually there will be. I know there's a lot of people who are very interested to at least try it because for whatever reason or another, they can't afford any other option or this or that. If you don't mind, I'd love to ask another CAP-related question, just because I don't think there has been a joining of these two worlds. I just did an interview with a lady, Alia Muhammad, who, when she was going through TSW, she followed the directions of her dermatologist to moisturize several times a day with, things with ceramides in it, and also some other thick organic stuff. And she developed this incredibly hard layer of keratin outside her entire body. And the sort of thinking behind that at the CAP clinics is that, well, these products are sinking in too deep into the skin because it's not normal atopic derm skin. It's worse. And so it goes to, and the skin pushes out this layer to help protect itself. Is that something that would make sense to you at all?
It could. I mean, I don't know. This is the first time hearing that hypothesis. It doesn't strike me as ludicrous on face. And this kind of dovetails with I don't know if you were hinting at it, the no moisturizer therapy approach that people have talked about. It's another one of those where you're like, boy, when you first hear it, that sure feels bold, because some of the patients with TSW clearly have dry skin. But at the same time, for me, I was thinking of it more of like the moisturizers having, they'll have ceramides in it as well as numerous other chemical products, right? And so
yeah,
is your skin reacting to those things abnormally in a way that's actually ends up being net detrimental? So is it better to toughen through and not use moisturizers? I don't know. It's hard to be dismissive of somebody who said they tried it and who had tried 75 previous things, and this is the one that they feel like has really helped them. Like, how do you just say like, well, that was placebo if it was number 76? And so like, again, another one of those things that would be a very beautiful study to like slot people into all of these different, word of mouth treatments and genuinely follow people to see like, all right, which of these is the most useful, and which could be combined, right? Like which, are there certain moisturizers that would make CAP more effective? Are there certain moisturizers that make CAP less effective? Are there moisturizers that would react with berberine in a negative way, right?
Yeah.
Or not, I don't know.
Yeah. And again, I mean, I'm not trying to say like ceramides are doing this or anything. I'm just observing, because I just kind of take it as data from people. But I want to be careful too, because I think even as you said, is like this condition expresses itself wildly different from person to person, and what works for somebody might not work for somebody else. And I mostly stayed away from products, except for when Olivia Freeman gave me this product that helped fix my shredded lapillidial fossa, which is, for people who don't know, it's behind the knees, crooks of your knees. And I found that to be useful, but only to a point. And so I think, I don't know, I just think knowledge is power, and being cautious of any product is good.
Even to that respect, like when I've gone online and seen people who self-report as TSW, the pictures that you can see can be wildly different, right? And so I don't ever want to say, well, so only the people who have the very classic look have TSW. It is completely, like, we picked 16 people who had that very classic representation and so forth. So it is possible that somebody out there might have TSW whose abnormality has nothing to do with the mitochondria. You know, it could be a completely different pathology. So a study that really tried to pull in all kinds of people who, you know, 100, 200 people who each say they have TSW, who don't look interchangeable, though, in the way that disease is presented in them, to do that kind of analysis to say, like, all right, what's different between these people? Do they have a different abnormality for which berberine and metformin would be useless? You know, those kinds of things would be, I think, very helpful in the field.
Yeah. Well, you know, I'd be glad to point people to you to help to any study, because I especially from this conversation, I feel very comfortable sending people with TSW to you, because you're very open-minded, but also careful not to harm anybody, no matter which camp it's coming from. So if anybody is listening to this and you want to help make history, this would be a great way to do it. And I've heard really great stories that, you know, people who were suffering and you went to their homes because they couldn't leave. And to me, you know, if there was a person to trust, I think it would be that person. And I want to extend my thanks on behalf of the TSW community, because Kelly Barta was telling me that your team was incredibly thoughtful, and so sorry that this happened to people. And this is the exact type of attention that it needs to join these two people together. Commander Ian Myles, are you hopeful for the future? Do you feel like there's going to be a hard battle to fight, or what do you think?
If you read the book Structure of Scientific Revolutions, it's back from the 50s, but that's where the words paradigm shift came from. Thomas Kuhn was the one who came up with that. The spoiler alert at the end of that book is it's basically like the previous generation that had built themselves on the old paradigm, they have to die. And then the new generation comes in and they've got the fresh thinking or whatever. What I'm hopeful about is that if we get this out there and at least starts the conversation, then it'll be impossible for anybody to go through dermatology training and not at least hear about it, right? So now when you are in that clinic and somebody walks in, this is not the first time you've heard this. This is like, oh yeah, my professor told me about that once in the day, which automatically makes you more open-minded to that conversation and probably a little more hesitant to refill the steroid prescription for that 4th month, right? Again, I don't know if some of the biggest blockades will have the humility to say, like, okay, that's interesting, I guess we should start researching it, or if it's going to be, well, it's just 16 people at this one study, who's to say? What I've found, there are plenty of people who just flatly dismiss it, right? Say it doesn't exist. The ones I think I find more obnoxious are the people who are like, well, yeah, they got something, but really they just need to treat the inflammation. And then they'll recommend some other pharmaceutical drug without any respect to the fact that the patients are rightly hesitant to listen to another prescription. So like, again, I guess I'm hopeful for, you know, the patients to have an opportunity to, you know, print something out, to be like, oh, look, this is an NIH sponsored study that says that I have something different and should be treated as such. And then again, I think it'd be nice to inspire other researchers to say, like, you know what, I had a few of those patients, because a lot of the people you talk to, they're like, yeah, I have 4 or 5, 6 or 7 of these patients who say it. I don't really know what to do. I offer them dupilumab, and, you know, like, what am I supposed to do? So they're open-minded, but they're kind of like handcuffed, because they're like, I don't know what to do here. But if you give them diagnostic criteria, you give them a biochemical assay that they could run, now all of a sudden you're like, you know what, I can maybe do a study in this, or or we can get this published and we can, get inspired. So again, it'll be that forking path, man. Like it's either going to be, I told you, it's either going to be a problem or it'll be obvious. And then I think this one, it'll be the same thing. I think I'm hopeful that people say like, well, yeah, of course, why did anybody ever think this was just eczema? And start acting accordingly. But I reserve the right to be disappointed.
Talking with some other friends from different types of families who are more, I guess homeopathic, and it's like, oh, I had eczema, but my family just told me to eat more nuts, and look at me now. And it's like, sometimes it's just as simple as like, think it through. Like, where are you living? Is there fungus in your home? Are you smoking too many cigarettes? Are you, and I think that eventually we'll get there. And I know you're a busy man, but and I'm very hesitant to end this call, but I really appreciate your time, not only in this call, but all of the work that you did, and I suspect we'll hopefully get to continue to do for this community. It's really greatly appreciated.
Yep. So we'll be in contact when we finally get this published, because then they can make their press release and give it, more, validation of peer review and so forth. But like I said, I feel like the levees are breaking or weakening against the community. I think the ICD-10 code, which is like how doctors would bill for it, I think that'll come. And I think once that's there, I've joked with Kelly before that as much as I despise medical lawyers, they might be an asset in the sense of, hey doc, why did you ignore this guy's claims? Or why did you refill that prescription for the second year in a row when all this evidence showed that was dangerous? And so then it just becomes a medical legal reason to take it seriously. So I think there'd be some of that too. But I think the levee's breaking, and I really find it hard to believe that 2 years from now we'd still be having a conversation about, does this exist at a conference, more so than, all right, what really is it? How can we fix it? How can we prevent it? How can we screen for it ahead of time? I feel like that's where the conversation will be by this time next year.
Let's hope, and I'll do everything I can to help make that happen. I'm really excited about the future. So once again, thank you so much, Commander Ian Myles. I really appreciate it. I'll stop the recording here. Peace out, world.